My roommate George and I met through work, and we ended up living together in a house about 15 minutes away from the office. We carpooled every day, and life was pretty routine. Work, home, sleep, repeat. About 2 weeks ago, something changed. A new neighbor moved into the house next door. The strange thing was, we never actually saw him move in. There were no moving trucks, no boxes, nothing. One day the house was empty, and the next day it wasn't. We didn't even know who moved in. Man or woman, alone or with family. We had no idea. After a few days, George and I decided to go over and introduce ourselves. We walked up to the front door and rang the bell. There was no answer, but his car was in the driveway, so we knew he was home. As we turned to leave, George suddenly grabbed my arm and told me quietly to look at the window next to the door. I glanced over and saw the blinds slightly lifted. Behind them, there was a man staring directly at us. He was just standing there, watching, not moving, not saying anything. We both looked at each other and walked away without saying a word. It was one of the most uncomfortable moments I've ever had. Right then, we both knew something was off about this guy. That same night, around 1 a.m., I woke up to a strange noise coming from outside. I went over to my window, which overlooked the neighbor's backyard. What I saw didn't make any sense. The neighbor was outside wearing a hoodie with the hood up, even though it was warm out. He was sawing a large piece of wood in the middle of the night. It was such a bizarre scene that I went to wake George. He was already awake, annoyed by the noise. We both agreed it was completely unreasonable for someone to be doing that at this hour. We decided to go over and politely ask him to stop. Since he was in the backyard, we knocked on the gate instead of the front door. The moment we knocked, the sawing stopped. Everything went quiet. We waited for him to come to the gate, but he never did. After a minute or two, we gave up and went back inside. At least the noise had stopped. But things only got worse after that. A few nights later, I woke up again in the middle of the night. At first, I couldn't tell what woke me up. Then I realized what I was hearing. Screaming. It sounded like a woman screaming, and it was coming from the neighbor's house. I rushed to the window and looked outside. I saw the neighbor again in his backyard, dragging something across the ground. I couldn't tell what it was, but it looked heavy. Then he suddenly stopped and slowly looked up toward my window. The moment I realized he was looking right at me, I stepped back immediately and ran to George's room. He was already awake, hearing the same thing. He grabbed his phone and called the police right away, explaining everything as quickly as he could. While he was on the phone, I stood near the doorway, trying to listen for any sounds from downstairs. And then I heard it. The sound of our back door slamming shut. We both froze and looked at each other. He was inside our house. George shouted into the phone, telling the operator to hurry because the man had just entered our home. I slowly walked toward the hallway and looked down the stairs. I could hear the floorboards creaking. Someone was moving down there, slowly. I backed away and ran back into George's room. We shut the door and pressed our bodies against it since there was no lock. A few seconds later, we heard footsteps coming up the stairs. Then the door handle started moving, and then he began trying to force the door open. He slammed into it again and again, and then started hitting it with something heavy. We pushed back with everything we had, not knowing what kind of weapon he might have. Then suddenly, it stopped. The footsteps moved away, heading back downstairs. Everything went quiet. After a few moments, we heard a voice from downstairs. "Police!" We looked at each other, thinking help had arrived. We slowly opened the door and stepped into the hallway, but there was no one there. That's when I noticed movement downstairs. Someone was hiding behind our dining table. It was him. I immediately told George to run. We both sprinted toward the stairs, but he came out from behind the table and chased us up. This time we ran into the bathroom and locked the door. He started banging on it immediately, trying to break it down. Then suddenly we heard another voice from downstairs, louder this time. "Police! Drop your weapon!" This time it was real. The banging on the door stopped instantly. We could hear shouting and movement downstairs. We yelled out to the officers, telling them where we were. A few moments later, they came upstairs and told us it was safe to come out. When we stepped out, the man was already in handcuffs. They had found a knife on him. We told the officers about the screams we had heard, so they went to check his house. More police cars arrived within minutes. When the officers came back out, they weren't alone. There was a woman with them, crying uncontrollably. She had been locked in his basement. And then they found something else, a dead body, in a bag. We never found out exactly who the woman was or who the victim was, but it was clear that the man we had been living next to was a killer. If the police hadn't arrived when they did, things could have ended very differently for us. The house next door is empty again now, and we're just hoping that whoever moves in next is normal. I own a small house in a rural part of New York, far away from the city. It's a quiet place surrounded by woods that stretch for miles behind the house. I usually go there a few times a year, mostly during the winter months, because there's a ski resort nearby where I spend time with friends. The area is peaceful, but sometimes that silence feels a little too heavy, like it's hiding something. There's a neighbor next to my property, separated by a wooden fence, but I've never really spoken to him. We've always just kept to ourselves. One January, I went up there for the first time that season. After a long 4-hour drive, I finally arrived at the house. As I walked up to the front door, I suddenly heard something that caught my attention. It sounded like a child laughing. The laughter was coming from the direction of the neighbor's house. I paused for a moment and listened, but didn't think too much of it. I assumed maybe they had kids, even though I had never seen any before. I went inside and started setting everything up. Since the house stays empty for most of the year, I had to turn on the heat, water, and everything else. By the time I was done, I was completely exhausted and went straight to bed, falling asleep almost instantly. The next morning, I got ready to go skiing. As I stepped outside, I noticed something sitting in the snow on my front lawn. It was a large red ball. I stopped for a moment because I was certain it hadn't been there the day before. I picked it up, assuming it belonged to the neighbors, and tossed it over the fence into their yard before heading out for the day. I spent the day skiing with friends, and by the time I got back, it was already dark. As I walked toward the house, I glanced at the lawn again. The red ball was back. I stood there for a second, trying to make sense of it. I figured maybe one of the neighbor's kids had thrown it back over. It was strange, but still explainable. So I picked it up again and tossed it back over the fence. That night, I went to bed early. Sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, I suddenly woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it again. The sound of a child laughing. It echoed faintly from outside, and this time it didn't feel normal at all. There was something off about it, something that made my stomach drop. I got out of bed and walked over to the window. I looked outside, scanning the yard, but I couldn't see anyone. The laughter had already stopped. But then I noticed something in the snow. The red ball was back again, sitting in the exact same spot on my lawn. A cold chill ran through my body. I stood there for a few seconds before deciding to go outside. I stepped into the snow wearing nothing but slippers and a robe, slowly walking toward the ball. I just stood there, staring at it, trying to figure out how it kept coming back. This time, instead of throwing it over the fence, I picked it up and brought it inside the house. I placed it in the living room, making sure I knew exactly where it was, and then went back to bed. For the rest of that night, I didn't hear the laughter again. The next morning, before heading out, I decided to finally talk to the neighbor. I walked over to his house and knocked on the door. After a moment, an older man answered. I introduced myself and asked him a simple question. "Do you have kids?" He looked at me with a confused expression and said, "No, I live here alone." The moment he said that, I felt a wave of unease wash over me. I thanked him quickly and walked back to my house. I left the red ball in the living room and went out for another day of skiing. By the time I came back that night, I was completely exhausted. I didn't even think about the ball anymore. I just went straight to bed and fell asleep. But once again, in the middle of the night, I woke up, and I heard it. The same childlike laughter outside. This time, I jumped out of bed and rushed to the window. I looked outside, and there it was again, the red ball sitting in the snow. My heart started racing. I ran out of my room and into the living room, tearing the place apart, searching for the ball. But it wasn't there. I knew for a fact I had left it inside before going to sleep. That's when the realization hit me. Someone, or something, had been inside my house and had taken the ball back outside. I turned on every light in the house, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of it. I checked every door and every window. Everything was still locked. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. It didn't make any sense, but I no longer felt alone in that house. I quickly started packing my things, throwing everything into my bag, preparing to leave first thing in the morning. After that, I slowly walked back to my room and looked out the window one more time. The red ball was still there in the snow, and behind it, there was a figure. It looked like a child, standing completely still, facing my window. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I knew it was looking directly at me. I immediately ducked down and shut the blinds. Then I went around the house, closing every single blind, making sure nothing could see inside. I got back into bed and forced myself to stay there. It took a long time, but eventually exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. The next morning, I didn't even bother with breakfast. I packed everything as quickly as I could and left the house. I didn't look back. The red ball was still sitting on the lawn, and to this day, I still can't explain how it got out of my house in the first place. But the part that haunts me the most was that child, standing alone in the snow in the middle of the night. And that laughter is something I don't think I'll ever forget. It was one night during winter break, and I was home alone. My parents were out of town, and the entire house felt unusually quiet. I was sitting in the sunroom, which is basically a smaller living room where we usually watch TV and movies. There's also a glass door in that room that leads out to the side driveway. I had all the blinds shut because it was completely dark outside, and I was wrapped up in a blanket watching some random movie just to pass the time. Everything felt normal, just the sound of the TV filling the silence of the house. Then suddenly the outside light turned on. We have a motion sensor light out there, so the fact that it turned on immediately caught my attention. I sat up straight and lowered the volume of the TV, trying to listen for anything outside, but I couldn't hear a single sound. No footsteps, no movement, nothing. After a few seconds, I carefully lifted the corner of the blinds, just enough to peek outside. I scanned the driveway, but there was no one there. I told myself it was probably just a raccoon or a possum. Animals come around here sometimes, so it made sense. At least, that's what I tried to believe. But something didn't feel right, so I decided to go outside and check for myself. I put on my shoes, unlocked the door, and stepped out into the cold night air. The driveway was completely empty. I looked around for a few moments, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sound, nothing unusual. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to relax. I sat back down and continued watching TV, telling myself I was just overthinking it. About 10 or 15 minutes later, I suddenly heard a loud crash from outside, like something heavy. Almost immediately, the motion sensor light turned on again. This time, a chill ran through my entire body. It didn't feel like an animal anymore. I stayed frozen on the couch. The strange thing was, the couch was positioned in a way that it was the only spot in the room where I couldn't directly see the glass door. And for some reason, I was terrified of standing up and looking at it, afraid that if I did, someone might be standing right there. I wanted to turn off the TV, but the remote was sitting in the middle of the coffee table, and I didn't even feel safe enough to reach for it. Then my eyes slowly shifted toward the blinds, and that's when my heart dropped. I wasn't looking at the blinds. I was looking at what was behind them. There was a clear silhouette of a person standing right outside the door. I could see the outline perfectly. Their arms were slightly stretched out from their body, just standing there, facing inside. My heart started pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. My breathing got heavier, and my hands went cold. I forced myself to slowly stand up, thinking I should get out of the room as quietly as possible. But the moment I moved, the figure suddenly started banging aggressively on the window. The sound was so loud and sudden that I screamed. In a shaky voice, I yelled that I was calling the police. After a few seconds, the banging stopped. But then I saw the shadow move, slowly, toward the door. I turned my eyes toward the glass door, and that's when I saw her. It was an old woman. Her hair was messy and wiry, sticking out in all directions. There was something completely off about her face, and her eyes looked wild, almost insane. For a brief second, I didn't feel as scared. But then she suddenly started slamming both of her hands against the glass door, screaming at the top of her lungs. That sound, it was terrifying. I immediately backed away and ran out of the sunroom. I grabbed my phone and called 911, my voice shaking as I told them there was a crazy woman trying to break into my house. They told me to go into a safe room, lock the door, and stay there until the police arrived. I ran into the bathroom, locked the door, and stood there trying to stay quiet. Then I heard it, glass shattering. She had broken in. My entire body froze. I could barely breathe. After a few seconds, I slowly reached for the door handle and carefully opened the bathroom door, just a little, enough to peek outside. She was standing in the living room, right in front of the broken window. The moment she saw me, she rushed toward the door. I screamed and slammed the bathroom door shut again, locking it as fast as I could. She started banging on the door nonstop, muttering something under her breath. I couldn't even understand what she was saying. I was too busy crying and begging her to go away. Then suddenly, I heard a loud noise from the front of the house. The police had arrived. A few moments later, everything went quiet. When I finally stepped out of the bathroom, the officers had already detained her. She was standing there, restrained, and as I looked at her, she looked back at me with the creepiest smile I've ever seen. Later, I found out she was a mentally unstable woman who lived nearby and had somehow wandered onto our property. But after that night, one thing became very clear to me. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or something supernatural. Sometimes it's just people.